Okay, so yes, let me welcome everybody as well. I just mentioned before that I've always have a little bit of a bad conscience on occasions of this, because most of the work was done by Isabel and Andrea in getting this huge conference, in fact, as it turns out, together. What I want to do as an introduction is talk a little bit mainly about my personal perspective on the conference theme. The idea for this conference was to bring together people of very diverse professions and that nevertheless often have to do with each other. I don't know how these are represented now in the audience, but basically we wanted to bring together users of digital humanities repositories, curators, which often also happen to be people who deal with more traditional forms of collecting documents, librarians, archivists, and designers of platforms used for digital humanities. And of course, these three have very diverging interests. I tried to sort of draw a map. Browsing is perhaps the user. They like to browse, and browsing, the etymology comes from grazing, eating. They want to consume. And that is often something which is very, or can be, very destructive. So they are tearing sort of into one side, which especially often the curators don't like. So annotating Linnaeus's personal copy of Systema Naturae with ink was perhaps allowed at the end of the 18th century, and then we're very happy if we find something like that. Or we might be happy if Darwin had done it, but nowadays it's not something we do. And of course, IT people, when you ask them what they are doing, they develop all the time. So one of my experiences in working with IT people is that I come with something I need, and then they say, yeah, we have the perfect thing for you. We're just about to develop it, and if you wait 2 or 3 weeks, you will have the perfect tool for your purpose. And if you come back 2 or 3 weeks later, they are still developing, and they are developing and developing. It's a complicated field, and we all have different interests. So, and I have to say of myself, I'm entirely on the browsing side. I don't know much about the technicalities of databases, and except what you use on your personal desktop or laptop, a little bit of Excel spreadsheet and things like that. And what I want to do in the following is, using some examples from my own work, describe the kind of challenges I see in bringing digital humanities forward from the cabinet to the internet, as we put it. So I'm going to present you with a user's perspective. One of my interests for a long time has been mimicry. It may have to do with the fact that the one phobia I have is against organisms that look like this. There are shivers running down my spine when looking at it, but it's a harmless moth, the hornet moth, aptly called the hornet moth. It's about this size, I think, so it really looks like a hornet. So what do I do when I'm interested in something like this? Well, the first thing I look for is a name. So here we have Cesia apiformis, and then I search. And there is a lot to search, of course, on the internet, a lot of databases. One of the first points of call is always Darwin Online. not because it is super sophisticated, but rather because it has so much. Yeah? It's a wonderful source for getting. So if I enter Apiformis there, I don't get Darwin, unfortunately, but Wallace, a review of works on mimicry, including the 4th edition of Darwin's Origin. That's why it's ended up in this repository, Darwin Online. He, of course, is one of the so-called discoverers of mimicry, alongside William Henry Bates. I think we have both of them somewhere here. Wallace is over there, Bates somewhere in this building, but I don't think in this room. Why discoverer? Something like this, one would assume, should always have raised the curiosity of naturalists. So one wants to go back. Why is he the discoverer? There are other earlier works of natural history in the Darwin Online repository, because it includes digitized copies of all the books that went with the Beagle Library, which of course is also useful, and gives a pretty good representative collection of what was available at the time. So we find William Kirby's Introduction to Entomology, and another work by a Frenchman, Boris de Saint-Vincent, who also mentions Thesia apiformis. What is curious is that Kirby, the older source, only mentions the plants that the caterpillars and the larvae of these moths feed on. He doesn't mention the striking resemblance to a hornet, but the Frenchman does, and much earlier than Wallace, which is interesting. There might be a hidden story in France somewhere there, and that one would have to go into. Okay, so if one then goes further back, Godard, that is already towards the end of the 18th century. One already has to go to another database, Bioheritage Library, also one of my favorites, also because it's not because it's so super sophisticated. It is getting more and more sophisticated, but because it has a lot. Then, of course, the more specialized collections, Linnaeus, and in Linnaeus had a specimen, so we can look at the specimen with a little label already written by Linnaeus. The label points to one of his publications, which one then can find on the Göttinger Digitalisierungszentrum. They have really a lot by now. One can also follow up the other sources Linnaeus himself mentions. None of these mention the fact that they mention the fact that it looks like a hornet, and even put it in the name. Api is, of course, bee. So why Linnaeus thought this looks like a bee rather than a hornet, I don't know. But I think there's some confusion of names happening there. Anyway, the point that I want to make is that you can already see, what you can already see here is that when you're doing something like this, the one thing that happens is that your screen fills up with open windows very quickly. One over the other, next to the other, and so on and so on. You end up with a kind of chaos. And I take this to be a key challenge, actually. To explain this, I want to define 3 challenges for digital humanities. First of all, I think it is very important to keep in mind that that even the kind of databases that I showed you before, the ones I use routinely, all are collections in the end. They are collections of digital documents. Collections, to work with collections, there's always three things you need, at least as a historian. You need, of course, to be able to navigate the collection. You need to be able to find things. You need to be able to locate them, and hopefully also to relocate them. That's very important. Very important with respect to archives for the historian, of course, you have to be able to historicize these sources. You have to be able to establish chronological sequences. In the end, that's the very first step, to historicize something. And you need to contextualize the things that you find in these collections. Yeah? Now, with digital technologies, I think there is really one key limitation, and that's, as I already mentioned, the screen. Yeah? The computer screen is what you see as a researcher, as a user. That's all you have essentially access to. I mean, if you're very sort of computer literate, you can perhaps go into images and so on and fiddle around with their format and so on, but that doesn't tell you anything about the thing you see. Yeah? It's at the very bottom there's a machine language only very few people speak, and the screen is really what you work with, and the screen is, of course, two-dimensional. It's not three-dimensional, which is an enormous limitation. Some games, of course, are sort of three-dimensional, so there's a lot of room for innovation, and I think this is the latest hype in digital humanities, that you apply gaming technologies to solve some of the problems. The screen is also singularly forgetful. You can, of course, press the print screen button and save a copy of your screen, but usually that doesn't give you a complete history of only create blocked disk space than anything else, I guess. And it is image only. I mean, even if we see a text, the text is essentially, in a way, an image. These are strong limitations as I see them. Now, okay, yeah, we should. Well, we actually have quite a bit of time. Your welcome was not 15 minutes. So what I want to do for the remainder, so I can spend a little time, but we may also want to have a little discussion of my talk, is look back at the paper world that I know a little bit about through my historical work together with Isabel. We've looked at how Linnaeus processed information on paper, how he worked basically on a daily basis, how he kept notes and so on, and see what kind of solutions and perhaps also opportunities this paper world offered in contrast to our screen world. Yeah? If that's the way we can put it. So I want to, in a way, to be a little bit counterintuitive here and say that maybe in the paper world some things worked actually much better than they do nowadays. Not out of nostalgia, but because I think that one can draw inspirations for solutions from that. So looking back at the paper world with these three challenges in mind, the first thing that strikes us about the paper world is, of course, that there you have to do with, always have to do in the first instance with objects. So even books are obviously objects. I was recently, I spent 3 months in Berlin at the Max Planck Institute for History of Science, and I'm collaborating in Berlin with a librarian at the Staatsbibliothek, and I was in her office, and there she had a copy of Systema Naturae. Actually, the first time that I could handle a copy of an actual, not a facsimile, but an actual copy of Systema Naturae. It's of course nice if you're with a special collections person at the Stabi, because in her own study, her own office, she can handle the books. We didn't even wear white gloves. So I think the market price now is something around £120,000 or something like that. So it's a physical object. It has a kind of value that is material. Yeah, that's why I mentioned the price. And one only gets an idea that I can't transport, of course, with this image, yeah, of what it is like to have this object in front of oneself and working with it by actually having it in front of yourself. Yeah? The image does only give you an image, yeah? But you can perhaps see a little bit, yeah, there are other books surrounding it, of course, so there is a context. Yeah? Some of them are newer, some of them are older, there are papers. We didn't annotate it, so. So the first thing is that you have to do with physical objects. Now this allows for a feature in the paper world that is quite important, I think, namely that you can actually spatialize. You can create spaces that are to some extent that you can to some extent simulate on a computer, but really only to some extent. It is quite difficult. The paper world was three-dimensional, books were objects, so you can actually arrange them in three-dimensional space. And libraries do that, and museums, very directly through shelves, drawers, all sorts of furniture, rooms, and so on and so on. Yeah? And this leads to a feature of collections of physical objects that is quite important, namely that they can form indexical spaces where one thing points to the other. Yeah? So usually this is done, of course, through labeling but the original cabinets, the cabinets of wonder in natural history, there's a lot of work on that. The objects themselves had symbolic values and were arranged in a way that was supposed to exhibit actual relationships between these objects. Yeah? So a princely collector liked to have a canoe from Greenland and some stuffed exotic birds, just to show how many connections he, or more rarely she, had. Okay? So things point towards each other. And this spatial organization also, this is of course what Linnaeus' Systema Naturae exploits as a book. This spatial organization also allows for something that I like to call synopsis, to see things at once, yeah, in front of you. And this perhaps not so much in the humanities, but definitely in the natural sciences is one of the big challenges now when they work with a lot of data, how to bring them together and present them synoptically. You get these crazy diagrams that graphic designers come up with, even artists, and the hope is that somehow one will get something out of that. Because books and collections are physical, it is actually quite easy to create these spaces of synopsis. Yeah? So one feature of museums, natural history museums nowadays, that almost all of them have, the big ones at least, is somewhere in where you enter into the museum, there's a big wall with lots of diverse species, and you're sort of presented with the image of biodiversity. Yeah? Berlin has a fancy wall like this. I think the Natural History Museum in New York was the first one to have a wall like this. Okay, to give you some examples from Linnaeus, his Herbarium Cabinet is a wonderful example. Linnaeus copied this idea from some botanists in the Netherlands, but was the first to really popularize it. He suggested that one should keep herbaria on loose sheets and keep them in a tailor-made cupboard like this, where you could have them in separate shelves, separated according to the classification system you were using. Each of these stacks is composed of files that correspond to one genus, and then that file contains sheets with the specimens on. Yeah? And this was, of course, a great mnemonic device for Linnaeus. He could sort of find immediately any species he wanted to find, because he knew where it was physically located in the Herbarium Cabinet. Yeah? In the computer, most of the time, the only thing you can do is search for a term. Yeah? And if you're lucky, you didn't commit a spelling mistake or were looking for the right term. Yeah? This is a nice example. The image here shows one of Linnaeus's herbarium specimens, where he got very fancy sheets from George Clifford, who was quite rich, with a little vase here, down here. Oh, this is upside down somehow. No. Yeah. A printed paper vase, so that very fancy sheets, but you see that Linnaeus cut these off to fit them into his Herbarium Cabinet. So beauty was not was not so necessary. The main thing was to create this physical order. This physical order, as I already indicated, with respect to Systema Naturae, the first edition, also extends to book. A book is literally a space, a three-dimensional space. This is an example from work I have done with Katrin Böhme at the Staatsbibliothek in Berlin on the personal copy of Carl Ludwig Willdenow of his Florae Berolinensis Prodromus, his Berlin flora. And he kept this copy because he was continuing to do botanical excursions within Berlin and around Berlin. And he used the kind of physical space that this book created to keep his notes, as you will see soon. A book always, of course, has a beginning and an end. It has, and mostly we know instinctively when we have to do with books where to find certain things. So obviously, the title page at the beginning. I'm saying obviously now, but this is not so obvious. I think the earliest printed books sometimes had it at the end, which seems totally counterintuitive to us, but they did. And at the end, we often find an index. In this case, Willdenow created a handwritten index in his book to document the new species he had found in Berlin when using this book on his notes. So, and that's almost automatic if you work with books. The index you look at the end. Yeah? That's Quite. And then he interleaved this copy. Linnaeus did this a lot as well, and filled in descriptions of new species he discovered, new places where he encountered certain species he had already described in the printed text on these interleaved pages. Yeah? So the space between two pages is used to keep notes on particular plants. Yeah? Okay. Another example, I will come back to Willdenow later on, but another wonderful example that Isabel and I have worked on is something Linnaeus used at the very end of his life, so-called paper slips. That's what they are called in the catalogue. One is very tempted to say index cards, and Isabel and I, we figured out that Linnaeus more or less used them in exactly the way we would use index cards. And index cards are, of course, a wonderful example for such a physical space in which you handle and locate and relocate and shuffle around these bits of information. That's how these index cards look like. Okay, now as physical objects, books and manuscripts allow for something as well that is not so easy to simulate with the computer, namely persisting accumulation of traces. It allows annotation. And the temporal relationship of these traces is often very clear because they get superimposed, so to speak. Yeah? So you can look at the physical traces and figure out which one comes first. You can do an archaeology of information quite readily, and this is, of course, important for the historian. So to come back to the example of Willdenow, that is a book that sort of consists of 3, if not 4, temporal layers. There's, of course, the printed text of the book itself, yeah? Which appeared at a certain date in time. Yeah? Then there is a document that was bound into the book by Willdenow, although the actual binding is probably later. We weren't quite able to figure this out. It's a little handwritten manuscript that Willdenow produced before he published his Flora of Berlin, and it's an extract of an earlier flora of the region around Berlin that was published towards the end of the 17th century, and Willdenow produced a systematic extract of all the species that Elsholtz, the author's name, described growing in the wider region around Berlin. So he did so probably in preparation for his own excursions, to know what had already been discovered and described, and in order to know what the new discoveries he was making were. Yeah? And then there is, of course, the third layer of his own annotations in the book. Yeah? So this book, such an annotated copy, sort of points both backwards and forwards in time. Yeah? It is, in fact, even if it has this feeling of an object, it is, at the time when it was used by Willdenow, it was actually quite a dynamic thing. It sort of changed all the time, yeah? With his annotations. Yeah, and this is just sort of the end of the catalogue of species described from Berlin in earlier literature, and a note that Willdenow makes at the beginning of the main text of his own flora that he has published, where he says that, well, what is to follow in terms of annotations, handwritten annotations, is in preparation of a second edition of Genera, of a second edition of the Flora. Yeah? He makes some particular notes here. There are also other kinds of, and that's why I said there are perhaps something like 4 layers of temporality. There are other kinds of notes, very few in this publication. Wildenau starts counting species. He counts the number of species that people before him had discovered in Berlin, and he makes a calculation, here on these pages, a calculation of the species he has described in the printed copy of Flora Berolinica, and the species he has added in his annotations. Yeah? So he's entering a kind of accounting mode. He's taking account of what he's done, and that, of course, can only be done once you've done the work. Yeah? There's even, and it's the only one little annotation by someone else, again a calculation, and what this person, a young botanist called Sigismund Kundt, what he notes down is the ratio between cryptogams and phanerogams in the terminology used back then. He does so because he is the one who actually prepares the second edition. Wildenau dies very unexpectedly and young, and Kundt takes over, and he wants to publish it in 2 volumes. And he's trying to figure out whether the division between phanerogams and cryptogams is a good one to produce these 2 volumes. So there's accounting going on here. That's the point about historicization. You can sort of turn books into historical documents for these kind of practices. The final point, contextualization, that's of course something wonderful about physical collections. It's this effect you have that if you browse an actual library, if you browse an actual museum collection, there's always the chance that something unexpected turns up next to the thing you were looking for. Yeah? You're making discoveries by chance, because that's, of course, sometimes built into the arrangement of a collection. Museums do this through taxonomic arrangements. Libraries do this, for example, by putting up their books according to the Dewey classification or some subject classification like that. And you're looking for one book, and then you discover next to it another one you had no idea existed, and it's very important for your work. This feature also extends quite often to things of all kinds of genre or media. Yeah? You can have, in a physical collection, you can have images, you can have drawings, manuscripts, books, shoes. Do we have Linnaeus' shoes? No. I think they are in Uppsala. Yes. They found a pair of shoes in his house, which probably belonged to him. That's a wonderful example of maybe a little bit of a crazy collection, because this was a story told to Isabel and me when we visited the museum in Uppsala, because there was a famous composer who lived in Linnaeus' house in the 1940s. What's his name? I forgot his name. He's very famous in Sweden. He had an accident in his bathroom, so there was a lot of water spilling over, and they had to replace the floors. And when they opened the floors, they discovered that in the 18th century, people had stuffed the floors with all sorts of things. Paper, a lot of paper, but also clothes. So that's how we found Linnaeus' shoes, but also some of his manuscripts, which were all stuffed into there. So quite unexpected sort of constellations can be created in physical collections. I don't think I have a very good example for that, but perhaps this example from Willdenow may help to bring over this point. I showed this image already. This is a description of a new species of a certain kind of grass. Forgot the English name now. Well, it's a certain kind of grass. Reed, is it reed? Does anybody know? Carex? Well, anyway, you use it in Germany. It is used a lot for thatching, and I think in this country as well. Anyway, it's a new species, and he enters it on a page next to other descriptions of Carex, the other Carex species, and it is called Carex paradoxa. And it is called Carex paradoxa because it doesn't fit the categories of Linnaeus' system. So what this shows is that the system that is used to arrange the species in the flora sort of is the framework that can generate surprises. Suddenly you realize, famously, Linnaeus' classification system builds on the male and female characteristics of flowers, and through its placement here, it generates this surprising insight that actually these are highly variable characteristics, or can be highly variable. And in a textbook of botany that Willdenow publishes a few years later, he even goes so far to say, that there's nothing as inconstant as sex or gender, which is at the end of the 18th century. You wouldn't expect anyone saying this. This is his herbarium. These are just illustrations of how this looks like. He collected quite a lot of the specimens of this species because this was a puzzling feature, that it varied in one of these important characteristics used by the Linnean system. And all this takes place, of course, within the context of huge collection activities in Berlin. Berlin wants to catch up with London and Paris, and it almost succeeds with quite a lot of investment. Just a couple of concluding remarks. As I said, I didn't want to be nostalgic here. I wanted to sort of bring out a couple of features that I think one should keep in mind that the paper world had. And of course, there's also no competition implied. We all know that by now, I think we've all realized that digital collections and physical collections can happily coexist. Most of the time, digital collections sort of enhance the drive to visit the physical collections. There are, of course, a lot of potentials in developing digital humanities tools that can sort of also do the kind of things that I was describing for the paper world. So that's where I want to end. Thank you.